Hello, esteemed listeners. Welcome to the channel. First, I ask that you share your thoughts in the comments after watching this video. Please also write down any areas I need to improve. This way, I can offer you a better and deeper journey into history. If you enjoy this type of content, please subscribe to the channel. Do not forget to press the like button. This provides support for me. It also ensures you do not miss our next historical journey. Today, I will present the untold story of Göbekli Tepe. We will discover who built it and what they believed. This journey is hidden within the silent stones of the past. We will explore the belief world of people from thousands of years ago. We will also uncover the secrets behind their rituals. I also ask you to share the date and time of your location in the comments. Reading about these moments from different corners of the world connects us. Now, slowly dim the lights. Pull your blanket over you and close your eyes. Let us take the first step into thousands of years ago in this first section. The horizon of southeastern Anatolia begins to change color with the first light of dawn. Imagine standing in a calm spot where mountains and plains intersect. The coolness of the air remains undisturbed. A gentle breeze carries the scent of earth and the distant sounds of sheep. The sky is divided by a pale orange line that opens into blue above the horizon. The silhouette of stone circles appears before you. They slept beneath the earth for thousands of years. The stones are silent, yet they make their presence felt. Göbekli Tepe first drew the modern world's attention in the mid-1990s. This area was actually the name of a hill known to villagers for centuries. However, no one had ever guessed the magnitude of what lay hidden beneath the mound. This site belongs to the pre-agricultural period of human history. It is considered one of the most remarkable archaeological finds. As you look at these stones, you can feel their silence. This silence is like a language carried from thousands of years ago to the present day. It speaks with carved symbols, stone pillars, and arranged circles instead of words. Walk up from the foothills of the mound. The landscape you see around you will transport you far beyond time. Approximately 12,000 years ago, people lived in these lands. They were not yet farmers. They had not yet established settled villages. They had not domesticated animals. They were hunter-gatherer communities. They spent their days searching for food and trying to survive. They adapted to the cycle of the seasons. At this very point, a situation emerges that still astonishes scientists. Pre-agricultural societies built such a complex structure. This turned the accepted understanding of history upside down. Consider this. At that time, there were no metal tools, no wheel, and not even writing. Pottery was also absent. Despite this, they shaped stone, blocks weighing hundreds of tons. They possessed the knowledge, organization, and belief to place them in an ordered arrangement. This situation makes the question of why Göbekli Tepe was built important. The question of who constructed it is equally significant. This was not an ordinary living space. No traces of families sitting by a fire and eating soup are found here. Instead, large stone pillars, circular arrangements, and reliefs of predatory animals are visible. Symbolic figures also appear before us. Walk through the silence of the excavation site. The only sound you hear around you is a faint hum carried by the wind. However, this silence is not far from the voice of history. The German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt was very surprised when he first arrived here. You can also imagine this astonishment. Schmidt immediately understood that this was no ordinary mound. The first large stone pillar unearthed featured reliefs. Figures of foxes, wild boars, and cranes were carved upon it. The stones stood like a message from the past. From that moment on, Göbekli Tepe ceased to be merely an archaeological project. It became a discovery that would cause the rewriting of human history. As you walk among these stones, your thoughts slowly take shape. The order you see here cannot be coincidental. The geometry and the placement of these stones was not accidental. It was the product of a specific purpose and a shared understanding. Perhaps this purpose was based on a belief system. They looked at the sky and followed the cycle of the stars. Perhaps this was a sacred center. Different communities gathered here at certain times. Rituals were performed and stories were told. As you approach the surface of the stones, the details of the reliefs draw you further in. Predatory animals may have represented power and danger. Lions, leopards, and snakes can be given as examples of these. Bird figures perhaps symbolize the ascent of souls to the sky. However, the certainty of these interpretations is not yet established. Archaeologists are still debating the meaning of these symbols. What you notice is this. Each carving is the result of a hand slowly leaving its mark on the stone. The owner of those hands may have worked for days. They might have even spent weeks striving to carve this surface. Perhaps with each strike, they carved a story into the stone. For someone looking at Göbekli Tepe for the first time, the silence might create a feeling of emptiness. However, this is not the case. When looked at a little more closely, the silence becomes understandable. The silence is filled with the accumulated echoes of thousands of years. These echoes narrate humanity's relationship with nature, with other people, and with the unknown. Every step taken here reminds us of something. You feel as if you hear the footsteps of the people who once gathered around these stones. They, just like you, stood in the center of these circles. They walked among the stones. Perhaps they gathered around a fire. So what drove these people to such a grand project? Why did they expend so much effort when their daily lives were already challenging? They were a community solely occupied with survival. So, why did they feel the need to build such a complex structure? The answer perhaps lies in one of humanity's most fundamental needs. This is the search for meaning. Göbekli Tepe might be one of the oldest expressions of this quest carved into stone. Yet, knowing precisely what this meaning is remains impossible today. It is here that the silent language of the stones leaves you with a question. Was this structure the product of a belief system? Or did belief systems take shape after this structure? To find the answer to this question, we must step out from the shadow of the stones. We must trace the hands behind them. The questions in your mind have not yet found answers. Your eyes focus on the marks on the surface of the stones. These marks are not only traces of art, they are also traces of labor and repetitive effort. These marks are also an indicator of a shared goal. When you try to imagine the hands behind Göbekli Tepe, you cannot see them directly. However, you can start from the signs they left behind. You can visualize their daily lives step by step in your mind. These people lived before the invention of agriculture. They migrated to find food. They followed the seasonal movements of animal herds. They were communities closely tied to the rhythm of nature. During the day, they hunted and gathered plants. When night fell, they sat around their campfires. The stones necessary for a structure like Göbekli Tepe were carved. The stones were transported and erected. This was a great effort that lay outside the daily cycle. There were people who came together for its construction. It is very clear that they were driven by a motivation that went beyond their normal lives. According to the traces found in the excavations, large T-shaped standing stones were discovered. These had been extracted from nearby limestone quarries. At that time, there were no metal tools. Therefore, hard flint was used to shape the stone blocks. This process could take weeks for a single stone. It could even take months. The blocks weighed hundreds of tons. Logs were used to erect them. There was nothing but ropes and human power. Perhaps hundreds of people gathered to move a single stone. The organization of such a task required leadership. This leadership might have come from the direction of a chief, or a respected elder had led the effort. Perhaps there was a shaman figure with spiritual authority. That individual brought the community together. Yet, the work done here was not merely a technical achievement. It is not difficult to understand this. The carvings on the stones indicate something. The purpose of the work was not only physical, it was also symbolic. Animal figures were present. Abstract symbols and depictions of hands and arms were also there. These formed a language of communication. It was an age without writing. These stones were a vehicle for collective memory. Each carving could have narrated a specific event. They also conveyed a myth, a community identity, or a belief. You are standing in the center of these stone circles. Try to imagine the emotions with which their builders gathered here. Perhaps different groups came here during specific periods of the seasons. Their reasons for coming were not only to continue construction, they also aimed to spend time together. Sharing meals, telling stories, and performing rituals were also important. Thus, Göbekli Tepe ceased to be merely a temple. It was also a center where social bonds were strengthened. Knowledge and experiences were also shared here. However, there is an interesting contradiction here. Archaeologists did not find any traces of continuous settlement at Göbekli Tepe. In other words, this was not a village or city. People did not live here permanently. They only gathered at specific times. This situation makes the meaning of the structure even more mysterious. Such a large structure was built without permanent settlement. This suggests that people came here from a very wide geographical area. Perhaps this was one of the earliest known examples of cooperation among early human communities. How did the people who gathered here feed themselves? Where did they sleep? Thinking about the paths they used to arrive reminds us of the difficult conditions of that era. Animal bones found in the vicinity indicate the animals they hunted. These were mostly gazelles, wild boars, and birds. Furthermore, wild wheat grains were also found. These people had not yet begun agriculture. However, they were gathering plants. Perhaps they were using simple processing methods. Gathering food and hunting were exhausting tasks in themselves. Despite this, they shaped stones weighing hundreds of tons. Placing them was not an activity that simplified their lives. Nevertheless, this effort held an important place in their world. This situation indicates something. Belief systems can be a very powerful source of motivation in human life. Göbekli Tepe may be one of the oldest monuments of this power. Most of the figures on the stones were predatory animals. However, some were more abstract symbols. These could be circles, crescents, or spiral shapes. Intertwined lines were also visible. The meaning of these symbols is not fully known today. But it is clear that these symbols held significant meaning for the people who carved them. Perhaps these were a type of calendar. Perhaps they were clan symbols, or they were parts of sacred stories that could be told visually rather than with words. Another interesting detail involves the T-shaped standing stones. Some had human arms and hands carved into them. This raises the possibility that these pillars might represent human figures. If so, Göbekli Tepe is not just a structure made of stones. It can also be considered a community of petrified human figures. This idea further strengthens the ritual purpose of the structure. The people who gathered here walked among the stones. In fact, they might have believed they were walking among their ancestors or sacred beings. As you delve into these thoughts, your eyes fix on the horizon. The sky here is still the same. It was also the same thousands of years ago. The builders of Göbekli Tepe probably observed the movements of celestial bodies. They transferred these observations to the symbols in their structures. When darkness fell, torches may have burned in the center of these stone circles. People studied the celestial sphere. Perhaps they told stories aligned with the cycles of the stars. Oral tradition formed here as one of the oldest ways of transmitting human memory. However, many questions still remain unanswered. Why were these monumental stones intentionally covered with earth thousands of years ago? This subject arouses great curiosity. Why such a magnificent structure was taken out of use is another mystery. Was this closure a type of ceremonial termination? It might have been abandoned after its function ended, as if an era of life concluded. These ideas lead you to one of the biggest unknowns behind Göbekli Tepe. Perhaps researching the lives of its builders will be essential to illuminate this secret. It is also important to look more closely at their belief systems. However, this research will direct you to even more complex questions. Could the symbols found here be humanity's first common form of communication? Are there still clues to this language today? These questions are a great source of inspiration for researchers. You continue to stand in the middle of these stone circles. Your gaze is fixed on the sun slowly rising on the horizon. The first rays of morning light define the outlines of the T-shaped monoliths. As the shadows lengthen, the details of the carvings on the stones become clearer. The figures on the stones seem to slowly come to life as the light changed. Those who came here thousands of years ago witnessed this same scene. This situation almost trivializes the concept of time. That moment is the same for both your experience and theirs. The only difference is that they knew the meaning of these stones. You are trying to decipher this meaning. Evidence found at the excavation site shows that the structures here were built with meticulous planning. The placement of each stone follows a specific order. Circular shapes are prominent. Two large T-shaped pillars are placed in the center. Smaller pillars surround them. This arrangement is far beyond merely randomly arranged stones. It is the product of a shared vision. Most likely, it is an architecture shaped by a collective belief. Unfortunately, this belief did not reach us through written texts. Instead, we have symbols, animal figures, and abstract shapes. These signs might have had a clear meaning for everyone living at that time. Each animal figure had an important role in the community's mythology. The serpent represented the underworld, while the crane depicted the soul's journey. The fox symbolized cunning or protection. Unfortunately, we cannot fully grasp these meanings today. This situation resembles a deliberately hidden secret from the past. As you stand here and ponder, you see that these structures are not just physical monuments. This place is also a treasury of memory. Göbekli Tepe inscribed the shared experiences of communities onto the stones. It also recorded their beliefs and their ways of perceiving the world. In an era before writing, these stones served almost as books. Each carving visually expressed a sentence or piece of advice. These narratives continued to live orally through generations in the community's memories. Archaeologists state that Göbekli Tepe was intentionally buried. Whether this act was for the preservation of the site or carried a ritual meaning remains a mystery. However, upon examining the burial method, it is evident that the site was not abandoned in an ordinary way. The gaps between the stones were filled with small stone fragments. Earth and animal bones were also used. This process required both a long time and considerable human effort. Those who closed the site valued the structure as much as its builders. At this stage, it is inevitable to ponder the complexity of the human mind. It was important to build a structure with great effort. Using it for years was also significant. Then, burying it intentionally in the earth is quite remarkable. This action demonstrates humanity's deep relationship with space and time. Perhaps the closure of Göbekli Tepe was part of the life cycle of those communities. Just as when a life stage ends, this place was abandoned after completing its purpose. Another possibility that comes to mind is this. Perhaps Göbekli Tepe was a symbol of an agreement among the communities gathered here. The structure might have been closed when this representation of unity broke down. It could also have been taken out of use when the community's way of life changed. The spread of agriculture led people to establish more permanent settlements. This situation might have resulted in them adopting different priorities. The new way of life reduced the need for ritual centers like Göbekli Tepe. However, this might have resulted in its respectful preservation rather than its being forgotten. As you wander among the stones, you feel the labor of hundreds of people behind each one. Thousands of individuals might even have worked there. Some were busy carving the stones, others toiled to transport them. Still others prepared for the ceremonies performed here. These efforts did not only require physical strength, they also demanded a sense of common purpose. Even today, ensuring such an organization is challenging. At that time, communication and transportation facilities were very limited. Considering these conditions, the achievement is even more impressive. You silently look around for a while longer. The wind raises a soft hum as it passes through the edges of the stones. This sound reminds you of a whisper from the distant past. Perhaps this whisper carries the footsteps of the people who once gathered here. It might also contain their conversations and songs. This silence is actually one of the deepest sounds of history. Listening to this sound, you understand that Göbekli Tepe is not just an archaeological site. It is also one of the oldest chapters in humanity's story. However, this page has not yet been fully deciphered. The silent language of the stones still holds undeciphered sentences and incomplete stories. Perhaps they will never be fully understood. Yet, this incompleteness makes the site even more meaningful. The human mind always feels curiosity towards the unknown. This curiosity transforms the silent stones of the past into today's most vibrant questions. Now, that first question still lingers in your mind. Who were the people who built this structure? Where did they come from? What compelled them to dedicate such a large part of their lives here? We are searching for the answers to these questions. To find the answers, we will need to know the hands behind the stones. It is important to examine the world they lived in more closely. This journey leads you to the next narrative. This narrative concerns the Temple of the Hunters. It explores the lives of the human communities behind Göbekli Tepe. After wandering among Göbekli Tepe's stone circles, those initial questions still echo in your mind. Who were the people behind this structure? What was their daily life like? Most importantly, how did this community, which had not yet transitioned to agriculture, build such a complex structure? They had not even established settled villages. When you turn your eyes to the horizon, you can imagine the traces of people who roamed these lands thousands of years ago. They were neither villagers nor city dwellers in today's sense. Their lives progressed within a constantly moving nomadic order. Living in harmony with nature's rhythm, these people subsisted by hunting and gathering. They had to adapt to the abundance and hardships brought by the seasons. Göbekli Tepe rose at the very center of this dynamic life. It functioned almost as a stopping point. At that time, the population of human communities was much smaller than today. The size of a group generally varied between 20 and 50 individuals. These small communities roamed vast territories in search of food. They followed the migration routes of game animals, according to the seasons. They gathered in a specific area for hunting in the spring months. Collecting plants was also vitally important for them. During harsh winters, they took refuge in more sheltered areas. This way of life required both flexibility and agility. However, it also necessitated cooperation among groups. The existence of Göbekli Tepe clearly reveals the dimensions of this cooperation. This place was not used by only one group. It must have been an area built by many different communities uniting. Archaeologists found traces of similar stone quarries in wide surrounding areas. This suggests that the stones used in Göbekli Tepe's construction were brought from various regions. Therefore, this place was more than just a center of belief. It was also a focal point for intergroup communication and interaction. When you consider their daily lives, you can imagine that most of these people's days were spent searching for food. Hunting required not only physical strength, but also strategy and patience. Animals like gazelle, wild goat, and wild boar were the primary hunting targets of that period. Flint was used for arrow and spearheads during hunting. These stones were carefully carved to obtain sharp edges. Women and children generally carried out the task of gathering plants. Wild wheat, barley, legumes, and various nuts were important elements of their diet. Nomadic life was not limited to food procurement alone. Social relations were an inseparable part of this way of life. Information sharing and rituals also played a significant role. Different groups shared their experiences when they came together. Hunting techniques were taught, and herbal remedies for illnesses were shared. These gatherings strengthened community identity and reinforced common values. Göbekli Tepe rose as a concrete symbol of such gatherings. People who came here did not just come to carve stones or share the hunt. They also gathered to feel part of a larger whole. Rituals held an important place in these communities. The abundance of the hunt, the reduction of diseases, and the preservation of nature's balance formed the central themes of the rituals. Göbekli Tepe's circular structures may have formed the stage for these rituals. Fires might have been lit in the center of the T-shaped monoliths. Songs were sung and dances performed around them. The animal figures in the carvings were also part of these rituals. They represented the mythological stories in the community's memory. You walk among the stones with these thoughts. At the same time, you try to grasp the effects of these rituals on daily life. In a nomadic life, rituals do not carry only a spiritual meaning. They also serve as social bonds, ensuring the unity of the community. Rituals performed together increased trust among groups. They reduced conflicts and facilitated unification around a common purpose. The existence of Göbekli Tepe is one of the oldest pieces of evidence for how strong these bonds could be. However, there is another striking detail here. Nomadic life necessitated constant movement. However, building a monumental structure like Göbekli Tepe required staying in the same place for a certain period. This might have been one of the first steps towards settled life in human history. People remained in the same area for months to build this structure. It is even possible that they stayed there for years. This process might have been a turning point leading them to agriculture and animal domestication. Nevertheless, what Göbekli Tepe meant for nomadic communities is not fully known. Was this a communal home or merely a sacred site visited at specific times? This remains an open question. Perhaps it served both functions simultaneously. Regardless, this was a place that allowed people to consider not only the present, but also the future. These stones held a meaning far beyond daily life. People looking at the sky in those times saw the same stars. These stars may have played a major role in their worship. Some researchers believe that the layout and column arrangement of Göbekli Tepe aligned with celestial bodies. This reveals the deep connection people had with nature. Hunting, plant gathering, seasons, and ceremonies were in complete harmony with the sky's cycle. However, this information is like chapters of an unfinished story. More data is needed to understand the lives, beliefs, and social relationships of the people who created Göbekli Tepe. These details might be hidden in the carvings on the stones. They could also emerge from as yet undiscovered underground remains. At this point, a new question arises. What did the nomadic communities learn from the ceremonies at Göbekli Tepe? Furthermore, what kind of knowledge did they carry away with them? Was it only belief that drew them here every year? Or did they have more complex and deeper intentions? The question of what nomadic communities gained at Göbekli Tepe still resonates in our minds. This question pulls one back into the stone circles. While observing the surfaces of the T-shaped pillars, it is clear this area was not shaped solely by belief. It was also formed by intercommunity interaction. The people gathered here did not only serve a spiritual purpose, they also exchanged knowledge, raw materials, and skills. Animal bones and plant remains discovered in excavations indicate this was an important meeting place. People traveled to this area from a very wide region. Surrounding communities gathered here at specific times of the year. They shared the meat, hides, and bones of the animals they hunted. They also divided among themselves the wild grains, berries, and plants they had gathered. This type of sharing was not merely an economic exchange. It was also a social bond that built mutual trust. In nomadic life, trust was one of the most critical elements for survival. Therefore, Göbekli Tepe was not just a place made of stones. It was at the center of a network woven with relationships. The construction of such a massive structure necessitated a division of labor among different groups. One group carved the stones, while another transported them. A third group carried out the ceremony preparations. Perhaps each group possessed a specialized skill. These might have included stone masters, hunters, gatherers, or ritual leaders. This differentiation ensured the continuous progress of work at Göbekli Tepe. Everyone's labor carried both physical and symbolic value. This is because every task performed here aimed to leave a mark, not just for that day, but for future generations. The communities gathered here also shared their cultural elements. Stories, songs, and dances were among these elements. Knowledge such as hunting techniques was also transferred. One group's understanding of medicinal plants spread to other groups. This transmission of knowledge was a rare phenomenon in the fragmented nature of nomadic life. Thus, Göbekli Tepe functioned as a kind of open-air school. The knowledge acquired here reached different regions through seasonal migrations. This information was then transmitted to other communities there. The ceremonies themselves were also part of these exchanges. The pillars adorned with animal carvings perhaps visually depicted the stories of these ceremonies. Participants gathered around these figures and relived the myths of their communities. Topics such as hunting abundance and the balance of nature were addressed in these rituals. The memory of ancestors also held an important place. Connections with spiritual entities might also have been established. Thus, Göbekli Tepe became both a sacred and an instructive place. This area might also have been a place that eased tensions between different groups. Nomadic life sometimes brought competition over resources. Hunting grounds, water sources, and plant gathering areas were limited. The shared use of all these restricted resources was essential. Göbekli Tepe may have served as a neutral zone where these tensions were resolved and agreements were made. Ceremonies were not merely an expression of beliefs. They were also practices that strengthened social compromises. Eating, dancing, and singing together helped people perceive each other as friends rather than enemies. The symbols on the stones could have been visual representations of these compromises and shared values. Perhaps a specific animal figure represented the totem of one group. A different figure might have symbolized an alliance between groups. In this context, Göbekli Tepe inscribed not only the stories of the past, it also carved the political and social order of that era into the stones. These stones served as documents, reminding future generations how this order was established. Economically, this area could have been a center for post-hunt distribution. Large hunts often required a collective effort. The meat, hide, bones, and other parts of the hunted animal were equally divided among the groups. Acting fairly during this sharing was extremely important to prevent damage to inter-community relations. The performance of ceremonies alongside this process made sharing seem like a sacred duty. Thus, the distribution of resources ceased to be merely a practical matter and became a religious responsibility. Considering these possibilities, it becomes clear that Göbekli Tepe was not solely a place of worship. It may also have functioned as a communication hub, a marketplace, and an educational center. It could even have been used as a venue for judgments. This versatility increased the area's appeal. As a result, it drew people from different places to gather there intensely at certain times of the year. Coming to Göbekli Tepe meant more than just participating in ceremonies. It also meant strengthening social bonds, forming new alliances, and exchanging knowledge. However, an unanswered question still remains here. How did all these actions create a sense of unity in the minds of those who built this place? For them, was Göbekli Tepe primarily a center of worship? Or was it a meeting point where inter-community relations were maintained? Perhaps no distinction was made between these two aspects at that time. This is because belief was an indispensable part of the social order. If this area contained both sacred and practical functions, then which elements of the ceremonies reflected in the daily lives of the communities? What influenced them and shaped their behavior even after they left this place? The question of what nomadic communities took with them when leaving Göbekli Tepe brings us closer to the distant past. This was not merely a place where ceremonies were performed. It was also an experience etched into people's memories, transforming their way of life and thought. Those who departed from here did not only carry the share of hunted meat allotted to them. They also took with them the materials they acquired through trade. They carried new ideas, stories, and symbols along with them. One of the most important functions of these ceremonies was to create a sense of shared identity. Groups arriving from various regions gained similar experiences at Göbekli Tepe. They gathered before the same symbols. They listened to the same stories and performed the same dances. These shared experiences allowed people to feel part of a larger community. In nomadic life, such bonds were as critical as existence itself. This is because cooperation meant finding trustworthy friends in difficult times. The ceremonies and symbols learned at Göbekli Tepe may have begun to be practiced in the participants' home regions. Perhaps small stone arrangements and carvings were imitated in different places. Similar ritual areas may also have been constructed. This represented a form of cultural diffusion. Ideas that originated in a single center could spread across a wide geography, thanks to the mobility of nomadic life. This was not just an architectural influence. It also signified a social and religious interaction. The role of ceremonies in the transition to agriculture could not be overlooked. The construction of Göbekli Tepe required long-term cooperation. This collaboration may have caused people to stay in the same area for certain periods of the year. This situation led to a closer examination of wild grains and plants. It might even have prepared the ground for their deliberate cultivation. Some researchers suggested that agriculture did not arise directly from necessity. Instead, they believed it emerged from the search for stability required for the continuity of ceremonies. If this thesis is correct, Göbekli Tepe was not merely a center of worship. It may have become one of the silent pioneers of the agricultural revolution. The social interactions experienced here may also have accelerated technological progress. Stone craftsmanship techniques, tool-making, and hunting strategies advanced. All of this became possible through the sharing of experiences among different groups. A sharper spearhead made by one group might have increased the hunting success of another. Such innovations demonstrated a collective development, not just a personal one. One of Göbekli Tepe's lasting impacts on communities was the meanings of its symbols. The figures on the stones may have been remembered not only during ceremonies, but also in daily life. Perhaps a fox carving was a symbol believed to bring luck during a hunt. Perhaps a snake figure was a sign of protection against dangers. These symbols continuously occupied people's minds. They shaped their perceptions of the world. Communities departing from here carried with them the relationships forged at Göbekli Tepe. People who carried stones together, shared the hunt, and stood side by side in ceremonies recognized each other at subsequent meetings. This familiarity formed the basis of trust in every new situation they encountered. Thus, Göbekli Tepe was not just a memory, but the center of an ongoing network. However, over time, the lifestyles of the communities gathered at this center began to change. Fluctuations in climatic conditions and shifts in animal migration routes were influential. Additionally, the easier availability of wild grains in some regions contributed to this change. All of these factors led people to reorganize their mobility. Some communities turned to agriculture, others adopted animal husbandry. Still others continued their nomadic lives. This transformation may have diminished Göbekli Tepe's importance. However, this did not mean the place was completely forgotten. On the contrary, its final use might be considered a deliberate closing ceremony, performed to preserve its significance. To understand what place Göbekli Tepe held in the memories of nomadic communities, it was essential to know how these people perceived the world. For them, nature was not just a living space, but also represented a sacred order. The rising and setting of the sun, the changing of seasons, and the migrations of animals were cycles of nature. All these were integral parts of life's cycle. Göbekli Tepe, meanwhile, was a turning point located in the middle of this cycle. For people, it was a symbol of both the past and the future. As one stands among these stone circles, reflecting on the past, Göbekli Tepe's greatest legacy emerges. This legacy may not have been physical stones. Instead, it was a shared worldview formed in the minds of people. The beliefs, values, and social bonds shaped here continued to exert influence for thousands of years. Even though the stones remained buried beneath the soil, the ideas they represented lived on in people's memories. However, a new question arises at this point. What kind of personal experience was this meaning for Göbekli Tepe's nomadic communities, for the stone carvers and symbol engravers? Did they see this task merely as a job? Or did they consider it an honor or a sacred responsibility. When one understands Göbekli Tepe's importance for nomadic communities, the carved figures immediately draw attention. Animals, abstract symbols, hands, and arms silently gaze from the stone surfaces. Even today, archaeologists have not fully deciphered the meaning of these markings. However, these signs offer clues about the identity of the people who created them. Thus, an imaginary journey into the world of the stone carvers begins. Being a stone carver during the Göbekli Tepe period was not an ordinary job. The concept of a profession as we know it today did not fully exist then. However, it was clear that some individuals specialized in certain tasks. These masters dedicated more time to carving stone than to hunting or gathering plants. They were known for their strong hands, sharp eyes, and great patience. Other community members respected them not only for their physical strength, they also respected them for the skill and knowledge required for this work. During that era, stone craftsmanship was not merely a hobby or art as it is today. On the contrary, it was an important part of rituals and community identity. Every relief on the Göbekli Tepe pillars was not made by chance. Every line, every indentation, and every figure resulted from a deliberate decision. These decisions reflected the community's beliefs, stories, and values. Thus, the stone carvers were not just performing a physical task. They were also carrying out a transmission of memory. Limestone was a common material found in the Göbekli Tepe region. Its relatively soft structure allowed it to be worked with flint tools. However, this fact did not shorten the duration of the work. Carving a single figure onto the surface of a large T-shaped pillar could take weeks. The master would begin work after sunrise in the morning. While the stone's shadows were at the most suitable angle, he would create shapes with delicate strokes on its surface. He would stop working as the sun set. Then he would leave the stone, only to return to the same spot the next day. This process repeated daily like a patient ritual. Imagining the working routine of the stone carvers, it became clear they possessed not only physical, but also mental discipline. They held flint chisels in their hands, with other masters nearby. While performing their tasks, they would also tell stories to one another. Perhaps the masters did not decide alone which figure would be carved where. Ritual leaders or the community's elders determined these decisions. Thus, stone carving became part of a broader decision-making process within the community. The fact that most figures on the pillars were animals shows that the carvers observed nature very closely. A fox's slender legs, a snake's curves, and a crane's long neck were quite striking. Capturing these details relied not only on memory, but also on long-term observation. The master would retain the animals seen in nature within his mind, then transfer it to the stone. This situation indicates an invisible link between stone carving and hunting. The sharp eyes of hunters, combined with skilled hands, created these figures. However, not only animals, but also abstract symbols attracted attention. There were many symbols, such as shapes resembling the letter I, circles, and crescents. Their full meaning is not precisely known today. However, it was very clear that there was a common language everyone could understand during that period. The stone carvers knew this language, and they could transfer it onto the stone. For this reason, their work was seen not just as technical, but also as a sacred duty. The tools used during the work were also remarkable. Flint chisels were sometimes sharpened with other stones. At other times, when their useful life ended, they were replaced with new ones. These tools themselves were made with great care. A good chisel determined both the clarity of the figures and the carver's working speed. Some flint tools found during excavations have survived to the present day, still bearing traces of use. These marks are silent witnesses to the long-term relationship the carvers had with stone. The lives of stone carvers likely held a special status within the community. They were rare individuals who combined both physical strength and fine craftsmanship. Even if they did not provide food like hunters, their work held an important place in the community's spiritual world. During rituals, people gathered before the figures they carved. Stories were told, and prayers were offered. Thus, the masters held both visible and invisible authority. Standing among these stones, one begins to see the traces of those carvers' hands. One notices a small notch, a fine line, or a deep groove made hundreds of years ago. All were the result of a person's deliberate action. These actions were not for just a moment, but for an existence that would last thousands of years. This awareness added a distinct meaning to the stone carver's work. However, the most interesting aspect of the work is that these carvers' names are unknown. We do not precisely know who they were, where they came from, or how they lived. Only their works have survived to the present day. This anonymity perhaps made their work even more sacred. This is because they created not for personal fame or reward. Instead, they worked for the common good and belief of the community. Now a new question comes to mind. How did these stone carvers learn their craft? Was this master knowledge passed down from generation to generation? Or did everyone participating in the rituals become part of this work? Not knowing who Göbekli Tepe's stone carvers were makes the question of how their knowledge and skills were transmitted even more intriguing. This was not simply a job requiring strong arms. It also demanded patience, observation skills, symbolic thinking, and a certain aesthetic sense. Therefore, such a talent was unlikely to emerge by chance. It must have been the result of a conscious learning process. Since written sources did not exist during that period, all knowledge was transmitted orally and practically. The relationship between a master and an apprentice was perhaps the most reliable method of knowledge transfer. Young people would join the masters from an early age. They would begin learning by first observing, then by assisting with simple tasks. Their initial duties probably included simple tasks such as cleaning the stone surface, preparing tools, or marking the area to be carved. This apprenticeship process was not limited to learning only technical skills. The stone carvers also taught the meaning of the figures. They explained which animal represented what or which symbol related to which story. Stone carving at Göbekli Tepe was not merely decoration. It was also a visual representation of the community's shared memory. An incorrect symbol could mean a wrong message. Therefore, training the apprentices' minds, not just their hands, was crucial. The master's knowledge transfer might also have been supported by specific rituals. Perhaps during certain times of the year, at large gatherings where communities came together, the masters would display their knowledge and skills to the young. This was both educational and a form of validation for the community. The acceptance of a new master depended not only on skill, it also depended on understanding and adhering to the community's values. Thus, stone carving evolved beyond a technical profession into a moral responsibility. Tool making was also an important part of the mastery process. Flint was the most important processing material in the region. Knowledge of how to carve it, at what angle to strike, and which stone to use for which task was passed down from generation to generation. A wrongly carved tool would both reduce the quality of the work and damage the carver's confidence. Therefore, it was not possible for apprentices to start major projects without mastering tool making. The training of a master probably took many years. During this period, The apprentice developed technical skills and also mastered the language of symbols. The transition to mastery might have been celebrated with a special ceremony. The community would gather to see the new master's first major work. They would accept that the person now had the authority to speak the language of the stones. Such ceremonies increased both the master's status and their credibility within the community. The selection of stone carvers depended on personality traits as much as talent. This is because mastery required great patience. Every strike and every line had to be carefully considered. Furthermore, grasping the sacred meaning of the symbols and showing respect for them was an indispensable part of this work. For this reason, masters were chosen from among trustworthy and respected individuals within the community. The work performed by Göbekli Tepe's stone carvers held a special position within the community. The figures they carved did not merely decorate ritual areas. They also carried the community's values, beliefs, and identity into the future. Therefore, the relationship between master and apprentice was not only a transfer of knowledge, it also guaranteed the community's cultural continuity. However, these masters might have served not only their own communities, but also other groups. Göbekli Tepe was a meeting point for communities coming from a wide geographical area. For this reason, masters from different regions might have collaborated there. This collaboration must have accelerated the spread of techniques and symbols. Perhaps a master brought a style of figure learned in their home region to Göbekli Tepe. In turn, they carried new symbols seen there back to their own homeland. Thus, stone carving became part of a regional cultural network, not just a local one. Such interaction can also explain how symbols changed over time. Some figures might have acquired different meanings in various regions. An animal considered sacred in one area could be a symbol of a completely different ritual elsewhere. The masters had to know this diversity and work accordingly. This situation indicates that they were not merely craftsmen, but also cultural intermediaries. Reflecting on the work of these masters, it becomes clear that their lives were not solely about carving stone. They were also individuals who built bridges between communities. They carried cultures and shaped beliefs. The language of the stones took form in their hands. However, the meaning of this language lived on in the shared memory of the communities. Over time, they would begin carving small figures or symbols under the master's supervision. Yet, a big question remained in their minds. Did these masters keep the meaning of the symbols entirely to their own generations? Or did they share this knowledge with a broader community? It was intriguing whether the stone carvers kept the meaning of the symbols only for their own generations. It was also a separate question whether they spread this knowledge to the entire community. These questions allow one to continue pondering slowly at the heart of Göbekli Tepe. One looks again at the figures on the pillars. A snake, a fox, a vulture, and abstract geometric shapes are visible. These were not merely decorations. They also carried meaning. These signs would come alive during emerging rituals. The language of these symbols was far more powerful than words. Writing had not yet been invented. However, people's memory was very strong in that era. When a figure combined with a generation's narrative, it could be passed down to future generations almost unchanged. Therefore, stone carvers decided carefully before carving a figure. They determined with great care what and how to represent it. An incorrect symbol was not just an aesthetic mistake. It could also create a problem that might damage the ritual's meaning. One of the most striking reliefs found in the excavations depicted a vulture with open wings. Next to the vulture, a shape resembling a human head was present. Some archaeologists believe this might relate to burial rituals. Perhaps the vultures symbolized the spirit's ascent to the sky. When a stone carver carved such a figure, he was not just depicting a natural bird. He also engraved society's belief in the cycle of death and life onto the stone. These symbols were placed in easily visible communal areas. This visually reinforced their belief systems. Other symbols were more abstract, requiring interpretation. These included interlocking circles, bowl-shaped figures, and zigzag lines. The modern meaning of these shapes remains unclear. However, these symbols were likely familiar to the people of that time. They might have represented star clusters in the sky. They could also have shown the flow of water or relationships between different tribes. Stone carvers used their own observations when creating these motifs. These symbols also reflected the community's collective wisdom. Therefore, they were products of both individual and collective memory. Stone carvers likely chose symbols after consulting with community leaders. They also exchanged views with ritual leaders. When a new pillar was to be erected, a communal meeting may have been held. During these gatherings, decisions were made about which figures to carve. This decision-making process ensured symbols received approval from the entire community. It was not just one person's choice. However, carvers could add their own skill and interpretation to the stone. Thus, each figure was part of a shared story. It also carried the carver's personal touch. The position of the pillars and their figures was not coincidental. In some circular structures, specific animal figures were placed facing each other. This arrangement may have aimed to create intentional interaction between symbols. For example, a snake figure might have faced a bird on an opposite pillar. It was as if they were conversing. During rituals, this semantic connection became clear to observers. Such arrangements indicate that carvers did more than just sculpt stone. They also possessed spatial reasoning abilities. The symbols at Göbekli Tepe may not have been unique to a local culture. Carvers might have adopted figures from communities in other regions. This could have led to the diversification of symbols over time. This may also have led to some motifs spreading over great distances. Perhaps a special figure carved by one carver appeared similarly in another community. This might have been hundreds of kilometers away. This is strong evidence of cultural ideas spreading even in that era. Symbols influence society beyond just rituals. These figures could affect people's daily decisions and behaviors. An animal figure might have reminded them which species to hunt. An abstract symbol might have indicated which activities to perform each season. Thus, symbols served as both sacred signs and practical guides. However, could every individual fully understand such a powerful visual language? Were some symbols understood only by carvers and ritual leaders? If so, this knowledge represented both power and great responsibility within society. The person holding this knowledge did more than just shape stone. They could also shape the community's belief system. With these thoughts, you walk with heavy steps among the pillars. You touch the carvings on the stone surfaces with your fingers. It is as if your fingertips feel the blow another person struck. This happened thousands of years ago in the same spot. This was not just a physical touch. It was a connection extending beyond time. That ancient carver was a human being like you. He watched the same sky and felt the same wind. His hands left a lasting mark on these stones. Today, you try to decipher that ancient message. At this point, a new question arises in your mind. Was the meaning of these symbols still the same in Göbekli Tepe's final phases? Or had they evolved into mere formal signs over time? Perhaps even the carvers who made them had forgotten their meaning. When you look at the carefully carved animal figures on Göbekli Tepe's stone pillars, you immediately feel it. you understand that they were not merely aesthetic elements. Animals like foxes, snakes, wild boars, cranes, and vultures were depicted in the figures. Each of these likely carried a special meaning. These creatures were central to the daily lives of hunter-gatherer communities. These animals were more than just sources of meat or hides. They were also carriers of the community's spiritual worlds. People living in these lands 12,000 years ago had a direct relationship with animals. People of that era perfectly knew animals' movements, behaviors, and migration routes. Survival depended on using this knowledge at the right time and place. For instance, they knew when a wild boar would become fatter. They also learned which season a crane would begin its migration. Knowing under which stones a snake would hide was vitally important. This knowledge directly affected hunting success and the community's lifespan. The depiction of these animals on Göbekli Tepe's pillars shows their value transcended daily life. Perhaps each animal formed part of a specific story. It was an important component of a legend or a myth. The fox may have symbolized agility and cunning. The snake was seen as a sign of both danger and wisdom. The vulture was associated with death and the soul's ascent to the sky. These symbolic meanings were not limited to rituals. They also influenced people's thought patterns in daily life. Hunting was one of these communities' most fundamental occupations. Hunting was more than just a method of nourishment. It was also the clearest indicator of cooperation and solidarity within the community. A large hunting operation required the participation of many individuals. The obtained meat was shared among community members. This sharing provided more than just physical food. It also strengthened social relationships. The animal figures at Göbekli Tepe might have been carved to recall these bonds. They may even have been used to celebrate them. Gathering activities were an integral part of this lifestyle. Wild grains, fruits, nuts, and edible herbs were available. These products formed the second basis of nutrition, alongside hunting. Women and children particularly engaged in gathering. During this activity, knowledge of plant ripening seasons was passed on. They also learned how to store plants and identify poisonous ones. This knowledge was passed down from generation to generation. It was as valuable as hunting skill. Perhaps some abstract symbols at Göbekli Tepe served as a calendar or guide. These indicated plant-gathering activities. Animals' spiritual position mirrored hunter-gatherer communities' relationship with nature. For them, nature was not a force to be resisted. Instead, it was an integrated structure to live within. Therefore, deep respect was shown for the spirit of a hunted animal. Rituals might have been performed to free its spirit after its body was used. Some communities even left the hunted animal's bones or hide in specific areas. This act served as a form of gratitude or farewell. Some scenes in Göbekli Tepe's reliefs perhaps symbolize these rituals. From this perspective, you might think the animal figures showed more than just what they hunted. They also reflected what people believed. Thus, a snake on the stones represented a concrete threat for people of that era. It was also a symbol of abstract wisdom. A crane was both a migratory creature. It also represented the soul's journey. Thus, Göbekli Tepe's stones served as both a biological and mythological record. This deep relationship with animals also shaped communities' seasonal movements. Game-animal migration routes influenced which regions were occupied when. This information was crucial for hunters, plant gatherers, and ritual leaders. Rituals were often performed in sync with specific animal migrations. They were also connected to seasonal cycles. For example, the start of gazelle migration was ideal for large community gatherings. This was also a period for performing communal rituals. The intense animal figures at Göbekli Tepe suggest it was more than just a belief center. It was also a place where nature's wisdom was transmitted. Communities visiting here shared more than just stonework or rituals. They also exchanged knowledge about animal behaviors, plant gathering, and hunting strategies. This vital information for survival was used collaboratively. Therefore, animal figures served as teaching tools. Younger generations stepped into their ancestors' knowledge by looking at these stones. When you look at these figures, you see they are not just silent witnesses. They also show how people of that era perceived the world. They reveal how they connected with nature and interpreted life's cycle. Each figure likely contained a story. They might have carried a lesson, a warning, or a celebration message. All these stories silently preserved their existence in Göbekli Tepe's stone circles. This continued for thousands of years. However, another new question comes to your mind at this point. Were these animal figures only a product of hunters' observations? Or were mythological narratives about these animals at the core of the community's belief system? Examining Göbekli Tepe's animal figures reveals they did not just come from direct observations. They also drew from deep belief systems and mythological stories. These figures held both concrete and abstract meanings for people of that era. In hunter-gatherer lives, animals were more than just a physical resource. They were also spiritual guides. Archaeologists note that some animals appear much more frequently in the figures. Foxes, snakes, wild boars, and various birds are frequently depicted. Some of these were primary hunting targets. However, other figures were carved with great care despite no practical benefit. This indicates animals were not just perceived as providers of food or materials. They were also seen as sacred beings. Mythological ideas were likely transmitted through oral stories during this period. These figures were passed down from generation to generation through traditions. An animal figure carved into the ritual area could function as the visual starting point for a specific story. For example, a fox figure could represent the memory of a legendary animal. This animal saved the community from a difficult situation with its cunning. A snake could be a symbol of both danger and change. This is because snakes appeared to be reborn by shedding their skin. These observations reinforced the mythological importance of animals. They moved animals to the very center of rituals. Bird figures found in the Göbekli Tepe reliefs, especially vultures, were connected with death-related rites. Some researchers suggest that these birds were believed to carry the spirits of the dead to the sky. The vulture could symbolize both the end of life and the journey of the soul. For this reason, the vulture figure was not just a bird drawing. It was also a symbol of the community's perception of life after death. Prayers recited in front of these figures during rituals held deep meaning for both the living and the deceased. Wild boars were also among the notable figures. These animals, known for their strong and aggressive nature, were symbols of courage or power. Hunting them was dangerous. Therefore, a wild boar figure could show the hunter's heroism. It also represented the prestige the hunter gained before the community. A boar figure on a pillar might have been carved in memory of an important hunt that occurred in the past. Such visuals reinforced the community's collective memory. They also passed it on to future generations. The animal figures at Göbekli Tepe likely contributed to the formation of a common symbolic language among different communities. An animal considered sacred in one region could begin to be valued similarly in another. This common language facilitated communication between communities. Different groups could perform rituals together when they gathered. Thus, animal symbols became part of a regional cultural bond, not just a local one. Considering how animal figures were used in rituals, it was understood that they were not merely visual decorations. Perhaps people danced and sang in front of specific figures during rituals. Prayers were offered for the abundance of the hunt. Perhaps some figures were seen as protective pillars forbidden to be touched during the ritual. Such ritual roles further strengthened the figure's place in the community's memory. It is also thought that animal figures might have served as markers recalling hunting seasons and migration routes. A specific animal on a pillar could have indicated the season when that animal could be hunted. Such practical information shows that the ritual area had a functional aspect, not just a spiritual one. From this perspective, the stones of Göbekli Tepe can be thought of as both a sacred text and a hunter's calendar. Animal figures also reflected a relationship of mutual respect with nature. For hunter-gatherer communities, animals were both a source of life and teachers. Observing their behavior was part of survival strategies. The hunting tactics of a wolf pack might have inspired humans to develop similar coordination techniques in group hunts. A bird's migration route might have shaped human seasonal movements. Therefore, animal figures were not only memories, but also guides. Looking at these figures at Göbekli Tepe, it felt as though they were words from a language from thousands of years ago. Each figure carried a story, a ritual, or a piece of knowledge. However, since the full grammar and vocabulary of this language are unknown, only fragments can be read today. Nevertheless, even these fragments provide strong clues to understand how the people of that era perceived the world. However, a question lingered in mind. Could the meaning of these figures have changed over time? Could the powerful symbolic meaning they held when first created have transformed into different interpretations over centuries, even across generations? The flow of time creates change in the meaning of symbols, as it does in human memory. The animal figures at Göbekli Tepe carried specific and powerful meanings when they were first carved. However, it is possible that these meanings slowly changed as generations passed. An animal figure was a visual representation of a sacred legend for the first generations. However, for later generations, it might have become merely an adornment of a ritual area. This is an inherent aspect of cultural memory. Meaning transforms over time, and sometimes it is lost. Let's assume that when a snake figure was first created, its meaning was very clear. This figure symbolized both wisdom and the underworld. Everyone who saw it knew what this sign represented. However, as centuries passed, new generations might not have heard the original story when they saw this symbol. The snake figure would still remain a respected sign. However, its meaning would blur. Perhaps it would only be known as an important shape left by ancestors. In this case, the symbol would retain its visual presence, but its inherent meaning would be partially forgotten. This shift in meaning could also be linked to changes in the community's way of life. The communities that built Göbekli Tepe had a nomadic hunter-gatherer lifestyle. However, over time, a transition to agriculture and settled life began. As the place of hunting in daily life diminished, the symbolic importance of hunted animals might also have evolved to a different position. A figure that once represented the abundance of the hunt might have been perceived more as a memory of the past in settled life. A change in the meaning of symbols also implies a change in rituals. In the early periods of Göbekli Tepe, rituals were performed around an animal figure. These rituals served purposes such as praying for the successful completion of a hunt. Thanking the animal spirit was also among these purposes. However, with settled life, these rituals might have given way to ceremonies serving wishes for bountiful harvests or different social purposes. Thus, the same figure would have acquired various meanings in different contexts. In this process, Some figures could also have been loaded with entirely new interpretations. For example, a bird figure initially symbolized the soul's ascent to the sky. However, in later periods, it might have come to represent the passage of seasons. It also represented news arriving from distant lands. Such transformations show that symbols are a living cultural structure, not static. However, despite all this change, the preservation of the visual form of the symbols is remarkable. This means that even if its meaning changed, the figure itself was still valuable to the community. This was important in terms of maintaining the connection with the past. The figure on the stone continued to live with new meanings. It also remained a silent witness to the past. This possible change can also explain why different communities continued to visit Göbekli Tepe in its later periods. Even groups with no direct ties to the original builders might have incorporated these figures into their own belief systems after seeing them. This suggests that Göbekli Tepe became not only a local, but also a regional center of attraction. The evolution of symbols' meaning, in one respect, did not diminish their power. On the contrary, it made them flexible enough to adapt to different cultural contexts. Perhaps the reason Göbekli Tepe maintained its importance for thousands of years was the layered meanings of its figures. Each new generation could find a meaning appropriate to its own time in these figures. Thus, they continued to keep them alive. Walking among the stones with these thoughts, one can imagine how the figures might have been seen by different eyes in different periods. For a first-generation hunter, the snake was a power to be feared before the hunt. For the next generation, it had become a symbol of protection and abundance. The same stone continues its existence, imbued with different meanings. This is an indicator of culture's transformation as well as its continuity. But beyond all these possibilities, the true power of Göbekli Tepe's animal figures lies in their being a common heritage. Even if its meaning changed, the figure itself would continue to be a focal point for the community. This bond unites people with their past, their ancestors, and with each other. And at this point, a new curiosity awakens in people's minds. Were these figures still actively used in rituals during Göbekli Tepe's later periods? Or had they merely remained silent witnesses to the past? Once accustomed to the silence of Göbekli Tepe's stone circles and the figures upon them, a question arises at one point. What does the soil beneath these stones tell us? Because the story here was not only in the visible pillars or carved figures, it was not hidden in the arrangement of the stones either. It was also concealed in the soil that surrounded and protected them for centuries. The soil is silent, but its memory is also strong. Each layer carries traces of a specific period. Every small piece left by rain, wind, people, and animals mixes into the soil over time. This mixture resurfaces thousands of years later with the strokes of a pickaxe. In the archaeological excavations carried out at Göbekli Tepe, the stories of these silent witnesses began to be uncovered. In the excavation work that started in the mid-1990s, at first glance, only the presence of stone circles had attracted attention. However, as the excavations deepened, animal bones began to be found within the soil layers. Plant remains, stone tools, and even sometimes small beads and ornaments also emerged. These were silent clues about the daily lives of the people who used this place. A wild boar bone indicated that this was a frequent hunting ground. Wild wheat remains suggested that plant-gathering activities also took place here. Beads revealed people's need for adornment and self-expression. The soil also preserved the strongest evidence that Göbekli Tepe was deliberately buried. Archaeologists noticed that the spaces around the pillars and stone circles were filled. These spaces were filled with small stone pieces, soil, animal bones, and other organic materials. This was not a fill that occurred naturally. It had been deliberately done by human hands. This situation suggests that Göbekli Tepe was not abandoned. Instead, it was put to rest with a kind of closing ceremony. So, why would a structure built with such great effort be deliberately buried under the ground? There is no definitive answer to this question. Some researchers suggest that this was a ritual closing. They believe the structures were ritually sealed after completing their purpose. Others think this burial process might have been done to preserve the structure. Perhaps there were reasons like changing living conditions, the transition to agriculture, or the establishment of new settlements. For this reason, Göbekli Tepe was no longer used as much as before. However, it was not intended to be completely forgotten. Another story the soil tells us is that Göbekli Tepe was used over a long period. Stone circles of different sizes found in different layers also showed that the site was used for an extended duration. This indicates that it was visited by various communities over centuries. Some structures are older, while others are newer. This suggests that Göbekli Tepe, although not a continuous center, was periodically revitalized. Stone tools were unearthed during the excavations. Flint knives, chisels, and arrowheads were found in particular. These tools show that both construction and hunting activities took place here. The bones found in the soil did not only belong to hunted animals, they also contained animal parts that may have been used in rituals. Some bones showed cut marks. This indicated that animal meat was shared communally. It also appeared that the bones were processed and left in a specific manner. All these finds indicated that Göbekli Tepe was a center of belief. Furthermore, it proved to be a place for social interaction, knowledge sharing, and communal activities. The soil is like a silent yet reliable record of what happened here. Figures on the stones tell what people believed. Finds beneath the soil reveal how they lived. Standing in this excavation area, one felt that the soil was like a time capsule. Every centimeter is a window into a moment thousands of years ago. Each of those moments deepens the meaning of Göbekli Tepe further. The soil conveyed a message with its silence. The stones were magnificent, but traces of life lay hidden within them. However, a question still remained. What secrets still awaited discovery within this soil? Were there more finds to clarify the larger picture of Göbekli Tepe's purpose? At first glance, the soil at Göbekli Tepe might seem like an ordinary mix of sand, stone, and dust. However, for archaeologists, this ground is like an archive carefully preserved for thousands of years. Each soil layer tells the story of a specific period. This story merges with the silent language of the figures on the stone pillars. Together, they present a much more comprehensive picture of life here. When excavation began, archaeologists noticed something important. Just beneath the surface were soil layers of different colors and textures. These layers were not random deposits formed by nature's cycle. The fill material in some areas consisted of light-colored, crumbled limestone. Another section contained dark brown soil, rich in organic matter. This variety suggested that people used the site for different purposes at various times. Soil analysis is one of archaeology's quietest but most effective tools. Every soil sample taken during excavations is carefully examined in the laboratory. First, a detailed observation occurs under a microscope. Researchers look for small bone fragments, charred plant remains, stone flakes, or seashells within it. Then, the chemical analysis phase begins. Which elements are concentrated in the soil is determined. For example, high phosphorus levels might indicate long-term human or animal activity in the area. Calcium levels help identify limestone density and the source of building materials. Soil analyses at Göbekli Tepe prove that not only rituals, but also intense social interaction occurred there. In some layers, numerous flint flakes were found alongside small bone fragments. This indicated that stone tool making took place in that particular area. Another layer contained charred wood fragments and ash deposits. This suggested that fires were lit at that spot, perhaps even for cooking. Thus, the soil also concealed traces of daily life. Animal bones found in the soil offer important information about the dietary habits of the communities using Göbekli Tepe. Among the most common species were gazelle, wild boar, wild sheep, and goat. Cut marks visible on these animal bones showed that muscles were separated from the bone. These marks indicated that meat was carefully removed from the bone. It was understood that the bones were then discarded or used for other purposes. Some broken bones suggested that their marrow might have been extracted. This is a small but significant detail, proving that hunter-gatherers wasted no part of the animal. The finds were not limited to animal bones. Charred remains of wild wheat and barley grains were also found in Göbekli Tepe's soil. These grains were likely consumed after being roasted over a fire. Agriculture had not yet begun. However, it seemed that wild grains were consciously gathered and processed. These remains show that human interaction with nature was not confined to hunting. They also prove that people possessed advanced knowledge of plants. Occasionally, small stone beads, seashells, and obsidian fragments also emerged from the soil. Obsidian is a type of volcanic glass. This glass was not naturally found in the region where Göbekli Tepe is located. This proves that obsidian was brought here from distant regions. Consequently, it was understood that materials were exchanged among communities. Seashells must have similarly reached here from distant coastal areas. Such finds suggest that Göbekli Tepe was not merely a local center. Rather, it proves the site was part of a wide network of trade and communication. Archaeologists follow a very patient method to allow the soil to speak in this way. During excavation, each layer is removed millimeter by millimeter. Every small piece found is numbered. Its location is also recorded. The value of a find lies not only in itself, but also in its context. When a bone fragment is examined with an adjacent stone tool, it helps us understand the nature of activity in that area. Therefore, soil excavation is essentially a type of slow reading process. The archaeologist deciphers a story thousands of years old, step by step. One of the most striking features of the soil at Göbekli Tepe is that most of the fill material was placed by human hands. The areas around the pillars were filled with small stone fragments, soil, and animal bones. Some animal bones thrown into this fill were thought to have been cut for ritual purposes. This burial process, therefore, was not merely a structural activity. It was also a symbolic act. The site was not abandoned. Instead, it was covered with a special ceremony. This closing ceremony might have been a community decision, declaring the end of Göbekli Tepe's function. Soil analysis indicates that this ceremony might have been gradual, not a one-time event. Some layers suggest that the fill was added at different times. This suggests that Göbekli Tepe was slowly put to rest over time rather than all at once. The soil also provides information about climatic conditions. Pollen analyses revealed that the region was not as arid during this period as it is today. More vegetation was present. This indicated that hunter-gatherers had abundant game animals and plant resources in their environment. However, changes in climate over time may have led to a decrease in these resources. Such a change might have directly impacted Göbekli Tepe's use. Burned clay fragments were also occasionally found in the soil layers. This indicated that open fires were lit here. Perhaps simple clay vessels were used even in the pre-pottery period. During the period when Göbekli Tepe was built, fired pottery was not widespread. However, it is understood that clay was shaped and used in simple forms. This suggests that people's knowledge of materials was more advanced than we previously thought. Among the finds were small chipped stone tools. Some of these tools were used for cutting, scraping, or drilling. Microscopic use-wear marks on the tools help us understand their intended purpose. For instance, where visible on the edges of some stone blades likely indicates the cutting of a hard surface, such as bone or wood. Such analyses confirm that Göbekli Tepe hosted not only ritual, but also functional activities. Considering this information, one realizes how the soil served as such a patient guardian. For hundreds of years, wind, rain, and sun changed. People came and went, yet the soil preserved these traces intact. Today, archaeologists unearthing these traces are effectively speaking with the silent witnesses of the past. However, a question arises at this point. Were there still undiscovered layers in the depths of the soil? Could these layers contain evidence powerful enough to clarify Göbekli Tepe's true purpose? If such evidence exists, how will unearthing it change our current understanding? Göbekli Tepe's soil is not only a silent witness to the past, but also a source of future questions. Every new excavation layer brings with it new questions as well as answers. The intentional burial process mentioned in the previous section remains one of the most debated topics. In the archaeological world, two main approaches seek to understand this issue. The first view suggests it was an entirely symbolic closing ritual. The second posits that the structure was closed for practical or environmental reasons. The closing ritual idea relies on the assumption that Göbekli Tepe had completed its purpose for the communities. According to this theory, the stones, soil, bones, and other materials filling the areas around the pillars were not random. Instead, they were placed with a specific ceremony. Each fill layer might have been added at the end of a seasonal ritual. Thus, the burial process was completed gradually, perhaps over dozens of years, not all at once. Viewed this way, Göbekli Tepe's burial meant protecting it, not abandoning it. The other approach was more pragmatic. It suggested environmental changes were behind Göbekli Tepe's burial. Reasons like altered animal migration routes or the transition to agriculture also played a role. This theory views the diminishing importance of Göbekli Tepe as a natural process as community lifestyles changed. Once the structure became unusable, instead of abandoning it, people consciously covered it. This kept the area orderly and preserved its memory. Both approaches can be supported by the findings provided by the soil. The fill material contained bones, stone fragments, and organic matter. These seemed like a mixture of daily life waste and ritualistically chosen objects. This suggests that the burial process might have had both symbolic and practical dimensions. The fill layers unearthed in excavations also had a striking characteristic. Most of the bones they contained were remnants of large communal hunts. This suggests that the burial process could be linked to large community gatherings. Perhaps after each large hunt, the bones remaining after meat distribution were ritually placed inside Göbekli Tepe. Thus, each fill layer sealed the social and ritual memory of an era. The soil revealed another detail. The burial process was carried out with a specific arrangement. In some areas, large stone blocks were intentionally placed. These blocks conveyed a deliberate message of closure when the area was excavated later. This could be considered a type of archaeological signature. Even thousands of years later, this signature was still legible. Göbekli Tepe's burial attracted the interest of many researchers. This interest was not limited to archaeologists working at the site. Scientists worldwide also focused on the topic. Such examples of intentional closure are quite rare. Archaeological sites are usually abandoned. They are naturally covered by soil and vegetation over time. However, Göbekli Tepe seem to have been deliberately hidden beneath the earth by people. This indicated how special a meaning the structure held during that period. Findings emerging from the soil's depths effectively caused us to rewrite Göbekli Tepe's story. When the initial excavations began, it was thought to belong to agricultural societies. However, animal bones, wild grain remains, and stone tools showed the opposite. Göbekli Tepe was the work of pre-agricultural hunter-gatherer communities. These findings overturned the known sequence in human history. The understanding of agriculture first and then temples changed. Here, temples appeared before agriculture. The soil held evidence of this revolutionary insight. Evidence still lay beneath the soil. Only a small portion of Göbekli Tepe had been excavated. Most of it still waited underground. This situation was both exciting and called for caution. Archaeologists knew that rapid excavation could damage the findings. Newly discovered artifacts, especially those difficult to preserve, were at risk. For this reason, excavations progressed slowly. Every new discovery was carefully documented. Considering this slow but determined process, the soil was a patient teacher for archaeologists. It was also a meticulous test. If each layer was not read correctly, it could be misinterpreted. The layer a bone fragment came from was crucial for understanding its story. Therefore, archaeologists did not see the soil as merely an obstacle. They also regarded it as a valuable guide. However, this meticulous work could not change an important unanswered question. Was Göbekli Tepe's burial in the earth an end that terminated its meaning? Or was it a conscious act to preserve the monument for future generations? The deep silence of Göbekli Tepe's stone circles concealed many stories beneath the soil. Considering this, the same context repeatedly came to mind. This structure was not just a center of faith. It also bore the traces of a community on the threshold of transitioning to agriculture. In the shadow of the stones, one of the last great periods of hunter-gatherer life was unfolding. 12,000 years ago, the people living in these lands relied heavily on seasonal cycles. When spring arrived, wild wheat and barley sprouted. Towards the end of summer, fruits ripened. As winter approached, game animals stored fat. Nomadic hunter-gatherer communities understood this cycle very well. They had to follow this cycle to survive. However, over time, the climate's rhythm began to show small but significant changes. Archaeologists and climate scientists determined when Göbekli Tepe was built. This period coincided with the early Holocene, following the last ice age. The Holocene brought a milder and relatively stable climate. However, this balance was not always perfect. Changes in the migration routes of game animals, in particular, began to challenge the community's annual plans. Even a small change in a gazelle herd's migration path could affect that year's hunting abundance. Göbekli Tepe's rituals were at the very heart of this seasonal sensitivity. Most likely, different communities gathered here at specific times of the year. They performed their rituals and exchanged information. This information did not only contain religious elements. It also covered daily life practices. Discussions included where more game animals could be found in which season. Information like when to gather wild plants was shared. However, this order gradually began to change with the transition to agriculture. The shift towards agriculture might have seemed like a natural progression at first glance. people began to live longer in areas where wild grains were plentiful. These extended stays allowed them to observe plant growth and maturation cycles more closely. These observations clarified the distinction between waiting and gathering. Over time, they understood that seeds could sprout again when they fell to the ground. This simple realization led to one of the greatest changes in human history. However, this transformation did not happen overnight. The communities working on Göbekli Tepe's construction were still hunter-gatherers. The first phases of the transition to agriculture began in the shadow of rituals. Wild grains were still gathered from nature. However, in some areas, there was evidence that people deliberately spread these grains. This was the most primitive form of agriculture. This method consisted of controlled gathering and intentional seed planting. This practice created an intermediate zone between nomadic life and settled agriculture. Seasons still played a decisive role in this process. Communities coming to Göbekli Tepe might have learned these first steps in agriculture by sharing with each other. Perhaps for the first time here, people from different regions exchanged ideas. Discussions included which seeds would sprout better in which soil. They also talked about which wild plants were more nutritious. This flow of information may have accelerated the transition to agriculture. Changes in climate were also an important driving force for this transition. Research revealed that short-term droughts occurred during Göbekli Tepe's active period. These droughts could reduce the number of game animals. They could also shorten the maturation period of wild plants. In such an environment, people's desire to secure their food sources increased. Agriculture became the most logical alternative to provide this security. However, the transition to agriculture was not merely an economic change. It was also a societal transformation. In nomadic life, communities gathered according to seasons, then dispersed again. Agriculture, however, required long-term settlement. This changed the function of seasonal meeting places, like Göbekli Tepe. There were rituals that once brought communities together. These rituals had to be reshaped according to the needs of agricultural communities. Göbekli Tepe's deliberate burial in the earth may have been related to this societal change. Communities that adopted agriculture no longer needed to come here every year. Settled villages could establish their own ritual areas. They could maintain their own social structures. Thus, Göbekli Tepe may have been respectfully closed as a symbol of the old order. Considering these possibilities, the lost rhythm of the seasons came to mind. There were migration routes that once shaped people's lives. Wild plant cycles and hunting calendars were also vital. All of these were replaced by the new order brought by agriculture. Communities now depended on the land. The season no longer only determined when fields would be sown. It also indicated when the harvest would take place. This new order created a fundamental difference in humanity's relationship with nature. However, an important question emerged at the heart of this transformation. How did the last generations who gathered at Göbekli Tepe experience this change? Did they realize the old rhythm of the seasons was gone and mourn its loss? Or did they embrace the security offered by agriculture with great joy? After Göbekli Tepe's massive stones were buried, the lifestyles of the communities in this region underwent a quiet but substantial change. This change encompassed many different dimensions. Not only did methods of food acquisition change, belief systems, social ties, and the perception of time were also reshaped. The transition to agriculture was the first sign that human communities began abandoning their nomadic habits, which had lasted for thousands of years. Nomadic hunter-gatherer communities were tied to nature's rhythm. Seasonal migrations followed the cycles of wild plants and animals. They arrived at specific locations at certain times each year. Short-term camps were established there. Then they moved again. This mobility also affected the social structure of communities. People encountered different groups throughout the year. Marriages, alliances, and knowledge sharing occurred during these migrations. With the transition to agriculture, this cycle ended. Communities adopting a settled life had to remain in the same place to cultivate the land. They spent most of the year in one location to protect their crops. This laid the foundations of a new social order. Each community now had tighter internal bonds. A more closed structure emerged against the outside world. The frequency of encountering different groups decreased during the nomadic period. Thus, intra-community relationships became more decisive. This change also had a significant impact on rituals. Massive and central gathering places like Göbekli Tepe were no longer a mandatory requirement for agricultural societies. Rituals began to be smaller scale and more localized. Each village or settlement created its own sacred space. These areas were not as grand as Göbekli Tepe's monumental stones. However, they were centers that strengthened the community's own identities. Stone circular structures gave way to simpler temples made of mud brick. Open-air altars also became more common. Furthermore, the content of rituals changed with the transition to agriculture. During the nomadic period, rituals were performed for abundant hunting. The return of animal herds and the safety of seasonal migration routes were also important. In agricultural societies, these rituals focused on crop growth. Topics such as timely rainfall and preventing crop diseases were also part of the rituals. The belief system's focus shifted to powers governing soil fertility alongside sky gods. During this period, the perception of time also underwent a substantial transformation. For nomadic communities, time was determined by hunting cycles and natural signs. In agricultural societies, the year began to be organized according to planting and harvesting seasons. This marked the initial phase of calendar systems' emergence. Perhaps for this reason, various structures were found in some settlements established after Göbekli Tepe. These structures consisted of stone alignments used to track seasonal cycles. There were also structures that indicated the sun's movements. People began to measure and program nature's time. The transition to settled life also changed how new types of relationships were formed among communities. Connections with communities encountered on migration routes existed in the past. These connections now transformed into trade networks. These networks, based on the exchange of goods and products, allowed for the bartering of various items. Products such as salt, obsidian, animal hides, and surplus grain were bought and sold. Trade became both a new criterion for wealth and a means of peace between communities. However, this new order brought by agriculture did not always bring peace. Land and water resources held vital importance in settled life. For this reason, disagreements occasionally arose between neighboring communities. Conflicts preventable in the past, due to nomadic life's flexibility, now emerged. In a settled order, these conflicts could lead to more lasting tensions. This led communities to build defensive structures to protect their lands. The first mud brick walls and moats were works from this very period. In the post-Göbekli Tepe period, similar structures began to appear in different regions. For example, settlements like Chayo Nu and Neh Vahli Shoh Ri were important centers for both agriculture and early architecture. In these settlements, religious and social structures were also intertwined. However, Göbekli Tepe's monumentality was not fully replicated in any of them. Perhaps this was a result of people turning towards their own smaller worlds instead of large common centers. Even for several centuries after Göbekli Tepe's burial, stonework was emulated. Stone symbols also continued to be copied in some regions. This shows that the monument's cultural influence persisted even among agricultural communities for a long time. However, over time, these symbols became part of daily life. Instead of massive sacred stones, simple motifs were carved onto house walls. Small stone figurines were also preferred. For the people of this period, seasons were still important. However, they were no longer shaped by nomadic life's variability, but by agriculture's predictable calendar. Spring was dedicated to planting preparations. Summer was for irrigation and maintenance. Autumn was the harvest season. Winter was used for storage and repairs. This cycle made communities' lives more regular. However, this also made them more dependent on the land and climate. Perhaps the most fundamental change occurred in human memory. Nomadic life had vibrant stories. There were journeys, valleys, hunting adventures, and encounters with distant communities. These gave way to more settled memories within the village boundaries. Children now grew up remembering days in the fields and seasonal celebrations. They no longer recalled migrations to distant mountains. For the first time in human history, place and identity integrated so firmly. These social and cultural impacts of the agricultural transition clarify the meaning behind Göbekli Tepe's burial. Perhaps this was a door to the ancient world, quietly closing. The last generations gathering around the stone circles understood an era was ending. They also knew a new order was beginning. Therefore, perhaps by covering the stones with earth, they also buried the old rhythm, old seasons, and old relationships. Amidst this new order, a question echoes in your mind. Did the transition to agriculture truly bring humanity peace? Or did it create another type of dependency? Could it have chained them to the land and the climate? These questions intermingle as you continue walking in the shadows of the stones. The day-long silence becomes more pronounced in the cool evening. The sky turns from the deepest shades of purple to orange. Then it slowly transitions to pale gray. The first star appearing on the horizon gives you a different sense of time. This is not the time of modern measurements. It is the sky humanity gazed at thousands of years ago. A wooden scaffold at the edge of the excavation site is a rare sign of the modern era. As you approach, you see the stone foundations beneath this structure. They appear to be placed here only temporarily. The truly permanent features are the stone circles beneath the earth. The standing pillars, however, defy time. On the surface of each stone are traces patiently sculpted by wind and rain. Some marks have erased figures carved with a sharp flint. However, others are still clearly visible. You can see foxes, snakes, and cranes upon them. Human-like figures with outstretched arms also capture your attention. You recall the meticulousness archaeologists showed while examining these stones. Every strike of the pickaxe was like an echo breaking thousands of years of silence. Yet these strikes did not just remove earth. They also unveiled stories hidden in the depths of time. Still, not every story is fully understood. Some stones carry meaning along with their figures. Others seem to have lost their meanings centuries ago. You sit at the base of a stone pillar. Almost the entire surface of this pillar is covered with snake figures. Slender, long bodies are intertwined. Their heads face upwards. The meaning of the snake here remains uncertain. Perhaps it represents a guardian spirit, or perhaps it symbolizes the delicate line between death and rebirth. This uncertainty is Göbekli Tepe's most powerful characteristic. Here, there are more interpretations than certainties. Every visitor projects their own past and fears onto the stones. They also see their own hopes in these stones. In the distance, a group of volunteers works at another excavation site. They have lit a small campfire, signaling the end of the day. Orange flames glow like a small sign of life in the darkening valley. Those sitting around the fire are whispering softly. Perhaps they are discussing a bone fragment they just found. Perhaps they are debating a figure on an unearthed stone. However, their voices do not reach this far. Only the rhythmic crackle of the fire is audible. Next to the stone where you are sitting, a small channel unearthed during excavation is visible. This channel was likely made for liquid flow. Water or another liquid might have been intended to collect here. Some suggest it was blood or drink used in rituals. Others argue it was made to collect sacred rainwater. Whichever is correct, this channel demonstrates the importance given to the power of water. It reveals how much people valued liquids. Stars are increasingly filling the sky. You imagine the same stars shining thousands of years ago. What stories did the people living then tell while watching the sky? Perhaps the stars were the eyes of the gods for them, or they were the lights of the spirits of the dead. Perhaps the sky itself became a witness during ceremonies within the stone circles. A story told by one of the archaeologists comes to mind. Years ago, during an excavation, a pit was found in front of a stone pillar. This pit contained small bird bones. The bones belonged to birds. This reinforced the idea that birds might have had a special place at Göbekli Tepe. Foxes, snakes, and scorpions were all carved into the stones. However, bird figures particularly stand out. Perhaps this was due to their connection with the sky. Perhaps they were seen as carriers of spirits. As you touch the cold surface of the stone, some of these stories flow into your mind. However, this flow is fragmented and contains missing pieces. That incompleteness forms the deepest truth here. We can never fully grasp the past. No matter how much we excavate, something will always remain hidden beneath the earth or within the stone. After a while, you stand up and walk towards the boundary of the excavation site. Night has fully descended. Lights from the camp are sparsely glowing. The wind has cooled somewhat. As you walk, you consider that dozens of undiscovered stone pillars might lie beneath the earth. Perhaps hundreds more pillars are waiting. This thought feels both exciting and a little melancholic. Even when all these stones are uncovered, their meanings might not be fully deciphered. Göbekli Tepe reminds you of something else. History is not just a reflection of the past. It is also a reflection of the present. Everything you see here tells of the people of its time. It displays their beliefs, fears, and hopes. All these emotions are carved into the stones. This night ends for you with the silence of the stones and the calm shimmer of the stars. As you return to the camp with slow steps, a single question lingers in your mind. Thousands of years from now, will the structures and beliefs we create today evoke the same feelings in another excavator? The deep silence of the night slowly envelops Göbekli Tepe's stone circles. The last sounds of conversation rising from the camp fade away. The wind blows gently from the hills. It brings a cool and ancient scent. This fragrance is a combination of dry grass, earth, and time. The moon, risen above the horizon, casts long, sharp shadows upon the stones. These shadows sometimes resemble the outstretched arm of a figure. Sometimes they highlight the curve of a snake. At times, they look like imaginary human-shaped silhouettes. You step silently among the stones. The figures you saw during the day look completely different in the night light. The distinct lines under the harsh daytime sun are now cloaked in the mysterious veil of shadow. Now the figures appear more vibrant and dynamic. The moon's silver light seems to animate a hidden story on the stone's surface. You stand behind a stone pillar and look carefully. You see a carved fox figure. It is integrated with the shadow. It looks as if its head is turned towards you. At that moment, you realize that every animal figure here is more than a mere representation. They are also the silent witnesses of rituals. They observed ceremonies and saw sacrificial offerings. They might have heard prayers. However, they never spoke. They only remained in the stone's memory. There is no definitive information about how rituals were performed at Göbekli Tepe. Archaeologists make inferences from the animal bones found. Stone pits, liquid channels, and figures also guide them. However, one thing is certain. This area was not an ordinary gathering place. The actions performed here were meant to strengthen people's connection between the world and the unseen. Perhaps ceremonies began just before sunrise. People gathered around the stone circles. Fires were lit, and smoke rose into the sky. Chants were sung. Some figures might have come to life only with masks used in ceremonies. Shadows flickered on the faces of those masks. With the fire's light, this created both a frightening and fascinating image. The stone circles beneath the moon act as a stage. In the center stand two large T-shaped pillars. These pillars feature reliefs reminiscent of human arms. It is as if these stones were not mere structures, but living beings. Perhaps during ceremonies, these pillars represented gods, ancestors, or nature spirits. You slowly walk towards the center. You are in the place where silence is most profound among the stones. Even the wind seems to blow more cautiously here. Looking at the ground, you see slightly hollowed marks. These are perhaps traces left by people who knelt thousands of years ago. Perhaps they are the footprints of figures standing and holding something in their hands. Every mark is a small sign reaching from the past to the present. In the depth of night, you imagine what a ritual might have looked like. Half-naked people stood around the stone circles. Some wore animal skins. They held flutes made of bone, drums, or stone bells. In the firelight, shadows falling on faces transformed the figures into something otherworldly. Perhaps that was a moment when people detached themselves from the world and drew closer to the unseen realm. Here, shadows were not just the absence of light. They were also a part of beliefs. People perhaps believed that shadows represented the boundary between the world and the realm of spirits. A shadow was an extension of its owner's soul. In ceremonies, these shadows were seen as a gift offered to the gods. Some archaeologists believe the rituals at Göbekli Tepe might have been related to hunting ceremonies. These rituals were thought to be connected with seasons, celestial events, or animal migrations. The figures on the stone pillars might be the keys to these calendars. Animals such as the snake, fox, crane, and scorpion represented different periods of the year or spiritual states. The ritual's purpose was to balance these cycles, increase fertility, and ward off evil. Looking closer at the surface of a stone pillar, you see faint lines unnoticed during the day. These lines were almost erased. However, they are still discernible. Perhaps these lines were carved with the slow and careful movements of a hand. You imagine that hand. Thousands of years ago, a stonemason working on this figure spoke of their own life. Perhaps they spoke of their tribe's story or their gods. Every line was a silent witness to that moment. There were no clouds in the sky. The stars shone clearly and brightly. Orion's belt had become prominent in the northeast. These stars, combined with the moon's light, might have been signs people used to time rituals. Some researchers believe the alignment of the stones is in harmony with the position of the stars. This suggests that the ceremonies were connected not only with the earth, but also with the sky. At that moment, you realize that everything was interconnected. The stones, figures, shadows, and sky formed a connected whole with the people and their beliefs. This connection was central to life thousands of years ago. It was a bond forgotten in the modern world, but still silently present here. This night was not just an observation. It was also a journey. The moment when shadow merged with the stone's shadows feels like a point where past and present touch. Perhaps this was the true power of the rituals. They carried people beyond their own time, connecting them to a greater cosmic order. Night slowly deepens among the stone circles. The first sounds of your imagined ritual begin to echo. This is a slow but steady rhythm, more like a heartbeat than a drum. The sound strikes the stones and reverberates. It is as if Göbekli Tepe itself accompanies this rhythm. Shadows flicker. Even the ground beneath your feet seems to subtly stir. The tribal members began to walk slowly in the outer circle of the stone rings. Every step carried a unique meaning. Some steps sought a bountiful hunt. Others hoped for rain. Steps were also taken to ward off malevolent spirits. The steps moved over ancient tracks on the ground. This revived memories of past ceremonies. Fires were lit between two large T-shaped pillars in the central circle. The flames created shadows that animated the figures on the stones. The serpent, fox, scorpion, and crane seemed to come alive in that moment. As the fire's smoke rose to the sky, the wind dispersed it into a ring shape. This ceremony might have been a way to send messages heavenward. Smoke ascended, carrying the community's prayers. In the ritual's second phase, the tribal shaman or leader appeared. Animal furs adorned his shoulders. A horned headdress or bird feathers graced his head. Charcoal and clay marked his face. His eyes held an intense, unyielding gaze. He transcended a mere human, becoming a conduit. At that moment, he linked the gods and the living. The shaman lifted his open hands toward the sky. His fingers trembled subtly. Words began to pour from his lips. Yet, this was unlike ordinary speech. It sounded more like murmured chants, understood only by those participating in the ritual. As his voice intensified, the drums quickened their pace. Each rhythm accelerated the heartbeat. During the third phase, offerings were placed before the animal figures. These included grains, pieces of meat, bones, and carved stone amulets in small stone vessels. These gifts were dedicated to both the deities and the forces of nature. A bone placed before the fox figure might symbolize the transfer of its cunning to the tribe. Grains sprinkled for the snake represented a wish for year-long fertility. After some time, the ritual's most silent phase began. Everyone knelt within the stone circles. The drums had ceased their rhythm entirely. Only the fire's soft crackle and the wind's gentle hum broke the quiet. The shaman leaned down, placing his hand on the stone surface, his fingers tracing the figures as if whispering an ancient secret. The stones seemed destined to guard this secret for thousands of years. This moment of silence formed the ritual's very heart. Here, people confronted their own shadows. These shadows stretched, bent, and sometimes vanished in the moonlight. Such moments perhaps revealed their inner darkness, helping them recognize their fears or desires. As the final part of the ritual commenced, movement resumed. People began circling the stone pillars, holding small stone fragments or bones. With each rotation, they lightly struck the stones. This sound was sharp enough to echo within the stones for centuries. Perhaps this action sought to capture the god's attention or signify the ritual's completion. The moon had risen higher in the sky. The stars now appeared brighter. The shaman gazed skyward one last time. Perhaps the sign he saw confirmed the ritual's acceptance. With the final drumbeat, everyone silently departed the stone circles. The fires slowly dimmed. Smoke vanished in slender wisps. Only the stones, shadows, and this night's memory endured. That memory would silently await on this hill for thousands of years, revealing humanity's forgotten bond with the universe. As the ashes of the fires cooled, Göbekli Tepe's wind, sweeping from the hills, reclaimed its dominance. The night, now cleansed of the ritual's intense vibrations, settled into silence. Yet, this was not an empty quiet. The shadows of the stones still stretched long, traces of the flames which danced upon the pillars through the night seemed lightly etched onto the stone surfaces. For a time, a few individuals lingered, unwilling to depart immediately after the ritual. They wished to remain longer, sensing the air, the stone's vibrations, and the night itself. Perhaps this marked a moment of individual connection. The communal prayers, songs, and movements of the ceremony had now concluded. Now was the time for solitary reflection, to touch the stones and gaze at the sky. These people, seated in the pillars' shadows, gently ran their fingers over the figures' surfaces. Each line carried the touch of other hands from thousands of years past. Fingertips sensed the serpent's curves, the crane's delicate wing lines, the fox's sharp gaze. This contact conveyed not only a sculptor's artistry, but also the deep meaning imbued within those figures. Every animal and every symbol silently carried a story, a belief, or perhaps a warning. Above, stars spread like a vast dome over the stone circles. The horizon stretched wide and unobstructed. No trees or tall structures cut into the vast sky. Lifting one's head, it felt as if the sky and stones told two sides of the same tale. The star patterns above and the stone figures below seemed to mirror each other. Perhaps the rituals aimed to unify these two reflections. Their purpose was to harmonize celestial order with earthly arrangements. The post-ritual silence was, in a way, as significant as the ceremony itself. For in that quiet, the drumbeat's echoes still resonated in their ears. Even with the fire's light extinguished, the flame's image lingered in their minds. Tribal members must have experienced this moment in the past as well. After the ceremony concluded, everyone turned inward. As they walked among the stones, they delved into their own thoughts. For some, this was a time to converse with ancestors. Göbekli Tepe's role as a gathering place for thousands of years was not solely about rituals dedicated to gods. It might also have involved reverence for ancestral spirits. Someone silently wandering among the stones perhaps believed an ancestor's spirit watched over them. Perhaps for that reason, they walked carefully. They gently touched the edges of the stones, listening to every sound the wind brought as a message. For others, this was a time to contemplate the future. One individual might predict seasons by observing the stars' positions. Another, inferring weather from the moon's shape, might weigh this information in their mind post-ritual. The prayers and offerings of that night might have signaled an approaching hunting season or a migration decision. For some, this moment was a confrontation with fear. Shadows were not merely protective, but also heralded the unknown. Human shadows, elongated by moonlight, merged with the stone's shadows. For a moment, it was difficult to distinguish which shadow belonged to a person or a stone. This represented one of the ritual's forgotten faces, humanity's confrontation with its own shadow. As night deepened, the last lingering individuals slowly departed the stone circles. The moon stood directly over the hill, and stars had grown slightly dimmer. The wind dispersed the final traces from the ceremonial area. Fire ashes blended with the soil, and footprints gradually faded. The stones were once again left alone, just as they had been for thousands of years. Yet, this solitude was not lifeless. Göbekli Tepe's stones preserve the memory of every ritual. Perhaps this is why the forgotten aspect of each ceremony never entirely vanished. It allowed anyone touching the stone's shadows to feel the moment's warmth, the smoke's scent, and the drum's rhythm. Over time, the details of these rituals faded from human memory. Today, we gaze at the stone figures, attempting to decipher their meaning. Yet, perhaps the full meaning will never be completely understood. Still, this does not diminish Göbekli Tepe's power. On the contrary, it preserves its mystery. The unknown holds as much value as the known, igniting imagination and prompting questions. Now, standing in this hill's silence thousands of years later, you could envision all phases of the ritual. You imagine the drum's slow rhythm, the flames animating the stone figures. The shaman's whispered words to the sky and the careful placement of offerings were also present. The moment of silence and the closing final drumbeat completed this visualization. All these elements re-emerged within these stone circles. Perhaps the true meaning was this. Shadows and beliefs represented humanity's connection between earth and sky. Even if rituals were forgotten, that bond still persisted. Between the cold stone surface and the distant skylights, a slow yet constant flow of the human spirit existed. This flow was as ancient as time itself, and as deep as the night. As you took your final step, you were now on the hill's slope. Outside the ceremonial area, you glanced once more at the stone circles behind you. They remained there, watching the night and embracing the shadows. You knew what you saw and felt here might be the same thing someone else experienced thousands of years ago. This understanding was akin to touching history's forgotten face. Göbekli Tepe's silent stones would remember this touch long after you departed.